This is fictional story to bring faith and heart.
The shoot had wrapped hours ago, but no one really left. Not emotionally, at least. Joe Rogan leaned back in a worn leather chair just outside the studio, sipping something warm and watching stars punch their light through the Los Angeles haze. Elon Musk sat a few feet away on the edge of a concrete planter, legs still in his usual tailored pants, but bare feet brushing the cool grass beneath. Between them lay X, Elon's boy, curled up with his knees to his chest, his small hand resting in the space between two blades of grass, as if he was waiting for the earth to whisper something back. No one spoke for a long time. There was peace in the quiet, the kind of peace that comes only when you're too tired to fake strength anymore. Then the boy said it. "Daddy," his voice floated gently, "if we build a city on Mars, will God live there too?" Joe tilted his head and smiled. A chuckle almost slipped out, not out of mockery, but wonder. He glanced toward Elon, waiting for one of those poetic, borderline scientific answers that always danced just on the edge of belief. But Elon didn't smile. His fingers stilled. He looked up at the stars and said quietly, "Maybe God isn't in the place. Maybe he's in the people who choose love, no matter the planet." The boy blinked, absorbing it like children do, not with reason, but with soul. "Then," he whispered, "I want to take God to Mars." Joe looked away. Something in him cracked, like a door that had stayed shut a little too long. No one said anything for a while. The silence wasn't awkward. It was holy. Elon looked at his son and asked, "Why would you want to take God to Mars?" The boy shrugged softly. "Because I don't want people there to feel lonely." That was the moment Joe Rogan, the man who'd asked everyone from neuroscientists to monks about God, aliens, and consciousness, wiped a tear before it even reached his cheek. And in the darkness he thought maybe no PhD could match the wisdom of a child still learning how to tie his shoes. "You think God helps people not feel alone?" Elon asked, still watching the sky. The boy didn't answer right away. Then he sat up and looked straight at his father. "Sometimes I think God is just waiting for someone to say they miss him." Joe felt that one, deep, like it was meant for him. Elon smiled a little. Not the public one, not the one cameras loved. A real one, small, faint, but true. He reached out and ran a hand through the boy's hair. "You might be right," Elon said. "Or maybe he never left. Maybe we just stopped listening." The boy was silent again. Not confused, just thinking. You could almost hear the gears of wonder spinning. "Do you think," the boy asked slowly, "that God talks more when we're quiet?" Elon exhaled through his nose and nodded slightly. "I think silence is where God speaks the loudest." Joe leaned back and looked up, like trying to hear it right then and there. And then the boy said, "Then why are we always making so much noise?" No one answered. Because the truth hurt too much. Because they both knew the noise. The interviews, the tech, the noise in their minds when they're alone. They knew how loud the world had become. And maybe they were afraid of what they'd hear in the silence. Joe broke the stillness, his voice lower than before. "Maybe we make noise to avoid hearing what matters most." Elon looked at him. Their eyes met like two men who had climbed different mountains and still ended up staring at the same moon. Then the boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny folded piece of paper. "What's that?" Elon asked. He unfolded it slowly, like it was something sacred. "A question," the boy said. "But it's not for you. It's for him." Joe leaned forward. "What does it say?" he asked. The boy handed it to his father. Elon read it silently. His eyes softened. His hands trembled just slightly. He passed it to Joe. Joe looked down. Scrawled in wobbly handwriting were just 4 words. "Do you miss us?" Joe didn't speak. He couldn't. Neither could Elon. Because suddenly, the question didn't feel like it was written by a child. It felt like something God had written to them. And that's when Elon said the thing that left Joe speechless. "But I'll only tell you that ahead in story. Are you ready for what came next?" Elon stared at the little folded paper, now resting on Joe's knee like it had weight. Not physical weight, but something heavier, something spiritual, as if 4 scribbled words could crack open the roof of the sky and make the universe lean in to listen. "Do you miss us?" The boy, barefoot now, stood and walked a few feet away into the patch of wild grass where the cameras had been set up earlier. The space was empty now, but somehow it felt fuller than it had all night. Joe finally spoke, his voice quiet, hushed, almost reverent. "That question, it's not for God, is it?" Elon looked over, his eyes tired but soft. "What do you mean?" Joe stared at the boy. "I think it's a mirror. I think it's what we are supposed to ask ourselves." He ran a hand across his face, suddenly overwhelmed by a feeling he couldn't name. Not sadness, not guilt, something older, something that had been asleep for too long. "Do we miss him?" Joe said aloud, the words sticking. Elon's face twitched, just slightly, that familiar tightness he wore when questions got too personal. The boy turned around and asked innocently, "Do you?" Neither man answered, not at first. Then Elon stood up and walked slowly over to his son. The gravel beneath his feet crunched quietly under his weight, like the earth itself was holding its breath. "I think," Elon began, pausing between thoughts, "I think I spent a lot of my life trying to build things that touch the stars, but I forgot to wonder who made the stars." The boy tilted his head. "You mean, you stopped wondering about God?" Elon nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just got too busy trying to be him." Joe felt that, like it punched through every wall he'd built with words, podcasts, laughter, and logic. He stood now too, slowly, as if drawn toward something sacred he didn't fully understand. The boy looked at both men. "But if God misses us, why doesn't he just come down and hug us?" That question hung like mist. Elon bent to his son's level, his voice softer than ever before. "Maybe he does," he whispered. "Every time someone chooses love, even when it's hard, every time someone forgives, every time someone listens instead of shouts." The boy blinked slowly. "So, hugs don't always look like hugs?" Joe, now standing beside them, added gently, "Sometimes a hug looks like silence, like being there without needing to fix anything." The boy nodded, and for a moment, no one said a word. The moonlight settled on their shoulders like a blessing. Then the boy asked, "Do you think there's a version of me in heaven already?" Elon looked startled. "What do you mean?" The boy pointed up. "Like, if heaven is forever, then maybe everything's already there. Even our best moments, even the ones we haven't lived yet." Joe's mouth parted slightly, stunned. The depth of the thought wrapped around his spine like a chill. "And maybe," the boy continued, "heaven is just when we finally remember what we forgot when we were born." Elon closed his eyes. That sentence undid something in him. He remembered something, maybe not clearly, but enough to ache for it. Then Joe said something no one expected. "I think that's why I've been afraid of faith." Elon turned. "Why?" Joe took a breath that shook a little. "Because if heaven is real, if God is real, then maybe I have to admit I've lived most of my life pretending I didn't need him." No one replied. The boy walked over and took Joe's hand. "You can start now," he said. Just 3 words. But they broke Joe Rogan wide open. He knelt down, looked into the boy's eyes, and whispered, "Do you really think he'd want me back after all this time?" The boy didn't flinch. "God's not counting time," he said. "He's just waiting for you to stop." Joe didn't know what to say. His voice caught. He looked up at Elon, who looked just as undone. And then Elon's son walked toward the edge of the field, where the night met the trees. He turned back and said, "I have another question for God." Joe managed to ask, "What is it?" But the boy just smiled and pointed to the sky. "I'm going to ask him where home really is." And with that, he stepped deeper into the dark. Leaving the 2 men behind, their hearts stirred, and a silence between them louder than any rocket they'd ever launched. Joe and Elon stood there for a long time, not speaking, just listening. To what? They didn't know. Maybe the wind, maybe their own heartbeat, or maybe that faint, ancient voice that only speaks when the soul gets quiet enough to hear. The boy had wandered just a little ahead, still within sight, walking like someone who wasn't really walking, like he was floating in thought, balancing between heaven and earth. Elon finally broke the silence. "Do you ever think maybe we're asking the wrong questions?" Joe looked over. "Like what?" Elon folded his arms and stared at the ground. "Like instead of asking if God exists, maybe we should ask if we still recognize him when he shows up in ways we didn't expect." Joe nodded slowly. "Like in a child's question, or a stranger's silence." Elon glanced at him. "Or in the fact that we're even having this conversation." Joe chuckled softly, but there wasn't any sarcasm in it. "Yeah, strange, isn't it? 2 guys who built their lives asking questions, suddenly realizing maybe the questions were asking us the whole time." A breeze passed through, rustling the grass. Elon's son had sat down now, cross-legged in the field, arms stretched behind him to lean back and look up at the stars. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was still, simple, sacred. Joe watched the boy, then turned back to Elon. "You know, I've interviewed astronauts, monks, shamans, neuroscientists, but that kid of yours just said more in 5 sentences than most people say in their whole lives." Elon half smiled. "Yeah, sometimes I think kids aren't learning Earth. I think they're trying to remember heaven." That hit Joe in the chest. His eyes welled slightly. He didn't try to hide it. "I used to believe in God," Joe said quietly, as if he were admitting something forbidden. Not like church God, just a presence, like something that held everything together. "But somewhere along the way, I got addicted to control, to evidence, to knowing things." He looked over at Elon. "But I never stopped wanting to be held." Elon didn't respond right away. Then he said, almost a whisper, "Maybe that's the core of faith, not believing in something, but letting go long enough to be held by it." Joe nodded. "That scares me." Elon asked, "Why?" "Because what if I let go, and there's nothing there?" Elon didn't try to answer. He just looked toward his son. The boy was tracing something in the dirt with a stick. After a minute, he stood up and walked back toward them. "I asked him," he said. Elon knelt down. "Asked who?" The boy smiled gently. "God." Joe raised an eyebrow. "And what did he say?" The boy looked up at the sky, then back at them. He said, "Home isn't where you live. It's where you stop running." That landed hard, for both of them. Elon swallowed. Joe sat down, suddenly tired. The boy turned to his father. "You don't have to build home on Mars, Daddy. You just have to come home in your heart." And with that, Elon's composure slipped. Just a little. His eyes blinked fast, holding back tears. Joe watched him, then asked, When's the last time you felt at home? Elon stared ahead. Maybe I never have, he said. Not really. Not fully. The boy took his father's hand. You can, but only if you stop trying to be God and just start being his. Joe looked away. That line, it was too much, too direct, too pure. The boy didn't say anything else. He just leaned his head against his father's arm and closed his eyes, like he wasn't afraid, like he trusted something they couldn't see. And as the wind blew gently through the field, Joe whispered to no one in particular, "Is this what faith feels like? Not knowing everything, but feeling known anyway?" No one answered him, but in the silence, it almost felt like yes. And then the boy opened his eyes and asked a new question, one that made both men sit straighter, hearts pounding a little. Do you think God ever cries? Elon's lips parted. He didn't know what to say. Joe leaned forward, locked in. The boy's eyes shone. Because if he does, I hope they're happy tears. He looked down quietly. I hope he's proud of us, even when we're not. And for the first time that night, Joe looked up at the stars and asked something he hadn't dared in years. Are you still there? He didn't expect an answer, but the next thing the boy said would feel like one, and it would change everything. The boy looked up at the stars, and the quiet wrapped around the three of them like a blanket. Not cold, not distant, just still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come often in a world full of buzzing phones and people talking over each other. Then the boy said it, so simply, so softly, it felt like a whisper straight from somewhere beyond. He said he cries when we forget how much we're loved. Neither Joe nor Elon responded right away. They didn't know how. That kind of truth doesn't hit the brain. It hits the ribs, the gut, the places we store every ache we've never named. Joe's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes were wet again, not because of the stars or the boy or the cold, but because something inside him was waking up, something he thought he buried beneath logic long ago. You really heard that? He finally asked. The boy nodded. Not like with ears, more like with my heart. Joe rubbed the back of his neck and laughed, not out of mockery, but as a defense. Man, I've interviewed hundreds of people who try to explain consciousness, faith, near-death experiences. And here comes a kid saying more in one sentence than all of them put together. Elon watched his son quietly. His eyes weren't the calculating kind he wore during product launches or interviews. These were soft eyes, father eyes, searching eyes. Do you think he's proud of me? Elon asked, barely louder than a breath. The boy stepped closer and didn't speak for a moment. Then, I think he's not waiting for you to be perfect, just to be present. Elon's head dropped slightly. His shoulders did too. Joe sat down again on the grass, like his legs couldn't hold the weight of everything he was feeling. And what about me? He asked. You think God could be proud of someone who spent his life poking holes in things people believe? The boy tilted his head thoughtfully. I think God's not afraid of questions, but he gets sad when we stop asking the ones that matter. Joe let that sink in, and he realized that's what had been missing. It wasn't the answers he needed. It was the right questions, the kind that don't lead to debates or headlines, but to humility. He looked up. What are the ones that matter? The boy sat down next to him, his little knees tucked into his chest. Like, what does love really mean? Or, what part of me still feels lost? He looked over at Elon. Or, who am I when no one's watching? Elon swallowed hard. And then the boy asked something neither of them saw coming. Do you think we could build a rocket that only carries prayers? Joe blinked. What? A rocket, the boy repeated. That doesn't go to Mars, just goes high enough to remind people that they're still heard, even when no one listens. Elon raised an eyebrow. You think we need rockets for that? The boy smiled gently. No, I think we just need reminders. And sometimes rockets remind people to look up. That hit like a silent meteor in Joe's chest. How long have we been looking down? Joe muttered. At screens, at numbers, at each other with judgment. The boy leaned his head back and looked toward the heavens. I think God lives in the looking up. And then, after a long pause, he said something that made both men sit in stunned silence. I think God misses when we used to look at each other like we were made of Him. The words hung like mist, like smoke from a sacred fire. Joe exhaled sharply, almost like he'd been holding his breath since the conversation started. He looked over at Elon, who was blinking fast again. You okay? Joe asked. Elon nodded faintly, but he was somewhere else. His mind, his heart, caught in a memory, a boyhood prayer, a moment with his mother, a night he once looked up at the stars and whispered, Are you real? But never heard a reply. And now here was his son, giving answers he never expected. Do you think heaven is watching us right now? Elon asked quietly. The boy's reply was simple, almost a song. I think heaven watches with tears in its eyes and hope in its hands. Joe closed his eyes. And Elon? He looked at his son with something deeper than love. He looked at him like someone who finally saw the road home. But just as the peace began to settle, the boy turned again, and what he said next would stop their hearts. Not with fear, but with a truth they hadn't been ready to face. The boy stood, brushing grass from his pants, and turned toward them with that same stillness, the kind that doesn't belong to kids or adults, but to something in between, something timeless. And then he said it. I don't think we go to heaven. I think we remember it. Joe blinked, unsure if he heard correctly. Elon tilted his head, caught off guard. What do you mean? Elon asked. The boys stared at them with a kind of gentleness that made you feel both completely seen and completely safe. I think heaven isn't some faraway place, he said softly. It's the part of us that knows how to love before we're taught to hate. It's the part we forget when we grow up and spend the rest of our lives trying to find again. Silence. Elon looked like someone who had just been handed the missing piece to a puzzle he stopped trying to solve years ago. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Joe finally spoke, but his voice was quieter than before. And what about the people who never remember? The ones who stay angry, or alone, or numb? The boy didn't flinch. God doesn't stop loving them, he said. He just waits, every second, every breath, like a father waiting at the window, hoping his kid will come home. Joe looked down, overwhelmed. The words landed like thunder beneath the surface, not loud, but deep. He bit the inside of his cheek to hold something in, a memory, a pain, a version of himself he hadn't spoken to in years. Elon sat down again beside his son, and for a moment they were just three people on a quiet field. But it felt like church. Do you ever wonder, Elon said slowly, why God lets us forget in the first place? The boy nodded. So we can choose to remember. That hit Elon harder than anything all night. Choice, not programming, not design. Choice. Love, not as a command, but as a return. Like gravity pulling us back to something we once knew, but dared to lose. Joe looked up at the sky, the stars now brighter, or maybe just clearer. So, heaven's not out there. It's in here. He pointed to his chest. The boy nodded again. Yeah. But sometimes the way back is through someone else's love. That sentence. Joe lowered his eyes, a flicker of shame, then vulnerability. I don't think I've loved right, he admitted. Not fully, not patiently. I've said the right words, but my heart hasn't always followed. Elon looked over at him. I know the feeling. Joe looked at the boy. How do we get it back? That heart? The boy tilted his head. You don't get it back. You grow a new one. Elon blinked. Grow a new one? The boy nodded. One that's softer. One that remembers where you came from. One that knows how to listen again. The silence that followed was so full it almost hurt, like standing too close to something holy. Joe finally said, I've spent decades chasing truth, but I think I forgot how to receive it. And Elon, in one of the most human moments of his life, put a hand on Joe's shoulder. Maybe we find it again together. Then the boy pulled something out of his pocket, a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it gently and handed it to Elon. Elon smoothed it out on his knee. There was a drawing on it, a simple sketch, a rocket. But instead of fire, it was lifting off on wings made of light. At the top, the faint shape of a heart. Joe leaned over to look. What is it? He asked. The boy looked up. It's the rocket I want to build with you, but not to go far, just high enough to remind people to love again. Joe's throat tightened. Elon ran his thumb over the paper. I don't know how to build that kind of rocket, he whispered. The boy smiled. I do. It starts with listening. And right then, something shifted in both men, a soft, invisible change, not the kind that shouts, the kind that takes root, quiet, deep, eternal. Joe looked at the boy one more time. And if we remember heaven, does that mean we can bring it here? The boy looked at him with eyes that saw further than time. That's why we came, isn't it? And with that, the moment opened. But the final question, the one that would change everything, still hadn't been asked. It was coming, and neither man was ready. The field was quiet again, but nothing inside them was quiet anymore. Something had shifted, deeply, permanently. Joe looked up at the stars and whispered, not even sure to whom, I don't want to forget this. Elon closed his eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't calculating or thinking. He was feeling, just feeling. And his son. The boy just stood there in the middle of the field, like he'd never been separate from the stars to begin with. He looked down at the drawing again, then slowly folded it, carefully this time, like it mattered more than blueprints or banknotes. Joe turned to him. Hey, that thing you said about heaven, that it's something we remember. The boy looked up. Joe's voice cracked slightly. What if I never remember it all the way? The boy stepped forward and took Joe's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. His small fingers wrapped around Joe's rough ones, and he smiled. Then someone else will remember for you. Until you do. Joe's breath caught. And then Elon's son looked at his father. Can I tell you what I think heaven really is? He asked. Elon nodded gently. Yeah, I'd love that. The boy paused, and then said, It's the place where nothing is missing anymore, where people finally believe they're loved, not because they did everything right, but because they never stopped mattering. The wind carried his voice like a prayer across the tall grass. Joe wiped a tear and chuckled quietly. That's the most beautiful definition I've ever heard. The boy's gaze lingered upward. I think heaven cries when we forget we're already part of it. Joe looked at Elon. Elon looked back, and something passed between them. Not logic, not certainty, just presence, shared presence. Do you think Jesus knew that? The boy asked, his voice gentle. Elon answered slowly. Maybe that's why he spent more time with the broken than the powerful, Joe added, and why he kept saying love was the greatest commandment. Maybe he was trying to bring heaven back through us. The boy nodded. I think he was reminding us that God doesn't live in temples or rockets or riches. God lives in the way we treat each other, especially when no one's looking. That silence returned again, not empty, full of all the things that couldn't be said, only felt. Joe took a deep breath. You know, I came out here to record a podcast, talk about AI and the future of space. He looked at the boy. But you reminded me I'm more than my questions. The boy smiled. That's because you are. Elon placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Do you think we could actually build this rocket of yours? He asked, motioning to the drawing. The boy looked between them. Only if we stop trying to prove we're right and start trying to prove we care. Joe's chest tightened. He nodded slowly, and then finally the boy asked the last question, the one that no one expected, but that both men would carry for the rest of their lives. If God asked you to build heaven on earth, would you even know where to begin? Neither Elon nor Joe answered. They couldn't. The weight of the question wasn't in its difficulty, it was in its honesty. Where do you begin? Joe looked down. Elon looked out. The boy looked up. And for one sacred moment, no one spoke, because that's when heaven is the loudest, when the soul finally listens. Joe whispered under his breath, maybe it starts right here. Elon nodded. With a child, he added, voice thick, and two men brave enough to follow. They stood together in the middle of the field, just three people, and yet something about it felt cosmic, eternal. The stars above, the earth beneath, and the space between, holy. Joe placed his hand over his chest. You think he's watching right now? The boy grinned. I think he never looked away. And in that moment, beneath the sky, beside the boy, and within their own trembling hearts, Joe Rogan and Elon Musk realized heaven wasn't a place waiting for them in the afterlife. It was a whisper calling them now, to build it, to remember it, to be it. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now. And that changed everything.